What up? Salo falava. Olo ingoa o Estella. My pronouns are she, her, sis, and uso.
What's good, fam? Como esta? My pronouns are he, him.
If you are just joining us for season 2, welcome. And if you are back, much alofa and gratitude for your continued support.
Now, I'm Gabriel Anthony Tanglau, first generation born, Filipino educator, union activist out here on the East Coast, New Jersey to be exact, North Jersey to be more exact, upon land that was cultivated by the Lenape people prior to European colonization. I now work full-time in the labor movement with the New Jersey Education Association.
And again, I am Estella Owima Church, daughter of immigrants by way of Savai'i Samoa and Calabar, Nigeria. I am a secondary theater teacher, union leader, and artist laboring on unceded Tanglau land, known to most as Los Angeles. Today on the show, we are jumping into our classrooms or learning spaces and what they looked like over this past year and a half mid-pandemic. How have they changed? Our relationship with kids and the context through which we teach, right? Like while we were virtual, I found myself sharing content very differently simply because I had no idea if on the other side of the camera, there is a parent recording me or taking issue with what I'm saying or how I'm saying it. We've heard wild stories from colleagues, from being fired for wearing a BLM shirt or put on administrative leave for discussing race in class. As many of us return back to physical classrooms, what does the future of instruction truly look like? And what should it look like, really? And also a big middle finger to this back to normalcy and business as usual BS. But before we get into all that, let's go ahead and check in. So, Gabriel, what's one of your favorite classroom memories with your students?
Oof, I love that question. There are so many, but I'm thinking back to my time at Bergenfield High School, where I taught economics and also modern world history for a number of years. But I remember in my economics class, we would often invite some, healthy debate and discussion around relevant issues at the time. Even in the modern world history class, we would do that often. It's one of the things that I enjoyed the most, but also I think my students seem to enjoy it. But I remember during one of the right before lunch, it was the period right before lunch, and I think we were having a debate and a discussion about, at the time, the Arab Spring was happening, and democracy, democratic movements across the Middle East were popping off, and we were watching so many of them in real time. And we're having some debate and discussion and just aspirational conversations about what's possible in terms of this Arab Spring moment. And I remember that with a few of the students engaging in some of that conversation, it spilled over into the lunch period. And, the bell rings most of the time. The students, as soon as they can, wrap up their books, put everything in their bags, and they're out, right? They're trying to get out of there. But, it was the heated discussion, the engagement, the real-time moment that we were experiencing together. And a bunch of the students ended up just staying over into lunch. Now, my union hat is telling me I should honor that lunch space, but it was one of my favorite memories because I remember just like it being a moment where the students were so engaged that they just they were enjoying the conversations as much as me. And it's interesting to share that memory after this past year, where I imagine that, if I were facilitating that dialogue over a Zoom or even attempting to, that the level of engagement, the level of enthusiasm, the level of interest might not be the same or feel the same. So that's one of my favorite classroom memories with my students. And I actually would love to hear one of yours.
I have so many. And as a drama coach or theater teacher, I try to honor that. My union hat also tells me honor your lunch period and walk out of your classroom. But if there are theater teachers out there listening, you know that your room is the kick it spot for all all of the theater kids, sometimes the band kids, and they're all just hanging out in your room at lunch. Especially on like a rainy day. But we would get into some wild conversations. And being a theater teacher, I spend so much time with students. We're together in class, after school for rehearsals to like 6, 7 p.m. when we're in production season. If it's competition season, we're together throughout the weekends, going to our festivals and competitions, and field trips all the time. So that's one of the blessings of being a theater teacher, is that I always get to know students away from the academics, and it's my favorite part. But my kiddos and we have this thing called the jar, and it's literally a jar. My first year teaching, it was very small, a tiny little mason jar. Now it is one of those giant jars with a big class that you like fill up with rice or something. Because every year students will buy me a bigger one for like Christmas or something. And the jar is just full of Post-its with dates on it and just the goofiest, silliest things that I have heard students say or watch kiddos do in class. And I'm trying to think of a hilarious one that's in there. Some of them are so like, if I had told you what it is, you'd be like, that's dumb. But in the moment, my kids and I were laughing for a good 20, 30 minutes and totally derailed the lesson and had a good time. Like I remember one year I was teaching 9th grade English, and, it's first week of school. Everybody's introducing themselves. And one of the young ladies in my class, actually a gentleman, he was introducing himself, and he was like, oh, I'm half Cambodian, I'm half Filipino. And this other girl, friend of his from middle school, has spoke up and said, what? That's not what you said in the last period. And he was like, baby, don't worry about it. I'm a bag of trail mix. And I don't know why that was so hilarious, but we were laughing for a good 20, 30 minutes. And that same young lady, she was my class clown, but also super great to have in class. But I love the class clowns, by the way. We have so much fun. But there was another time where she had to come back to somebody else in the class. She was like, I'm as hard as raw pasta. And I don't know why that was so hilarious, but I was like, we got to stop class. I got to write that one down. It goes in the jar. Thank you for that. And so the jar moments range from like kids, I don't know, falling over in chairs and doing stuff silly to like asking me questions that I don't know how to answer the question. And I write it down and put it in the jar. So the jar is just all my happiest moments in the class with students. And they tell me all the time, and she got to put it in a book when you're like retired, just make a book of all the silly things we say. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. And a couple of y'all would have a whole chapter dedicated just to you. But yeah, that's my jar. It's my favorite thing. And unfortunately, teaching virtually, I didn't get to have a lot of those moments. And so I'm really looking forward to, is probably one of the few things I'm looking forward to is my jar being back on my desk with a pile of Post-its next to it, and us, having conversations about nothing and everything.
And those are the best moments, right? Those are just absolutely, I love that they're filled with what could be inside jokes, but I remember even being a student, we often talk about our memories as, being educators, but my favorite moments that I still recall are the ones that were the inside jokes, cracking up in class, having those moments. So I love the jar moments. I imagine you have so many, and I love that the jar grows every year. So looking forward to hearing more of those in the future. Sidebar. But
yeah. So thank you for sharing that. It's a nice way to start our conversation today. But on the union leadership side, what has been some of the toughest adjustments, and how have you navigated that? And also, what has emerged, or I guess, what have you gleaned from the pandemic? For example, are there issues that were brought to light or made more clear for you as one of the folks that educators will turn to when we need union support?
Yeah, so just to clarify, my role over this past year was in the professional development and instructional issues division within our union. So I did have really a line of sight into how the pandemic was impacting many of our educators out here in New Jersey. I even think about the past year and reflect on it in phases, right? The early phase was filled with so much uncertainty as we were first quarantined and everybody adapting, also recognizing that there's so many of our educators that would need to become more comfortable and familiar with some of the tech and virtual learning spaces and adjusting to that. At the same time, recognizing that students, many of our students, all of the inequity that we talk about, access to reliable broadband internet or having the devices that allow them to engage in the virtual learning in that emergency moment. Those were some of the issues that we were addressing on the front end. Also, early during that time, I remember just the narrative of gratitude that parents and the public were expressing because they didn't understand fully just how challenging educators have it in terms of the skill set, the professionalism, the space that they have to hold in their 9 to 5, right? And that shifted over this past year in a few ways. So, as you mentioned, there's some attention being paid in critical ways. It's almost like what you mentioned earlier about, like, especially in this moment where the CRT and the anti-CRT movement is rearing its ugly head, that it's almost like another layer of pressure that really undermines educators' ability to do what they do, right? But before I go down that path and unpack that a little more, to your question, what are the issues that have emerged? I think that the issues of inequity are one that's emerged, become very clear. The issues that, educators and the support that they need to respond in real time to just the uncertainty and the crisis moments, to lean into that. And then what did the union do to support our educators? In New Jersey, I could speak directly to trying to make sure that we provided the professional development support, the tools, the resources, especially with, I think, a generational divide. There's a generation of educators that really needed to have even more support in this virtual environment to become more familiar with tech tools. I will actually frame that as something that I think has been one of the biggest growth points for a lot of educators that we've seen, as being in a virtual space has become normalized in some ways. But it doesn't quite get to the heart of what we just started this conversation with, which is education is such a human and humanizing experience. There's moments of joy. There's the social emotional aspects of it that get lost in translation through this Zoom box or this whatever tool you're using, or tools that you're using. Technology alone, virtual learning alone, cannot replace the educational experience in person. And that's just something that is emphasized and highlighted over this past year. From your lens, Estella, what has been some of the issues that you've seen?
I think everything that you mentioned, we knew equity was already an issue, but I think it not only was it exacerbated by the pandemic, but it was made very obvious to all the folks who would have liked to continue denying that equity is an issue in our profession and in our field. I also think that it became more apparent the inequity that teachers of color deal with across the union and on our site campuses, because not only did I see an increase, and I'm talking about the district my daughter goes to school in, Black parents were saying, oh no, it wasn't working before. Clearly, it's not working now. I'm pulling my kid out. We're finding another option. If we're going virtual, I might as well homeschool and do it my way anyway. And Black teachers this year were like, we already had a small number of teachers of color, Asian and Pacific Islander teachers and Black teachers. But this year we were just like, no, like we're not doing this anymore. The number of teachers who chose early retirement rather than stay virtual, like that has to scream to folks outside of our field. Like, yo, like we're doing everything we can. And in some cases feel like it's never enough and we're drowning. But to the flip side of that is I think more and more teachers are, myself included, are not willing to fall on our sword in a way that continues to cause harm and trauma for ourselves and our families. We have spouses, we have children, we have elderly parents that we look after, we have family that we also have to be present for. And those relationships often go by the wayside because we are so hyper focused on every single child in our class and every single issue that they have and every single need that they need met. And we talked about this in that self-care episode, right? Like, we're so willing to put ourselves on the back burner because we are so committed to the kids in our charge being able to thrive. And I am just now realizing that I can still be committed to that and also not put myself last. Right? And so I think that the pandemic made that very clear for a lot of teachers. Who, the year was just rough for. Even if you're tech savvy, I'm pretty tech savvy. It was still hard, like to get through. Thank you for your response. So another thing that popped up during the pandemic is we were hearing about a lot of our colleagues across the country being put on leave or fired because they were wearing Black Lives Matter shirts to class, or they used land acknowledgement poster in their Bitmoji classroom, or they had a LGBTQ plus affirming wallpaper in a Bitmoji room or something, or on their slides. And there was a story in my local where a teacher had been harassed so bad by the parents in that neighborhood for wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt that union siblings came together to donate to help her move out of the town she worked in because her life was being threatened. That's the type of stuff that teachers of color were up against. And even white educators who consider themselves allies were also up against during this pandemic. During season 1, we learned from a lot of our guests that ethnic studies was a major part of their formation and their growth, as well as their cultural, ethnic, and racial identity development. So where the country is now in regards to this debate on CRT or critical race theory, where is it coming from? I don't even understand why it's a debate really, because in the K-12 system, we are not explicitly teaching critical race theory. So what is your hot take on this issue?
Yeah, and to your last point, CRT or critical race theory comes from a school of thought that's grounded in legal studies, right? So when we're talking about inclusive curriculum, representative curriculum, we're in two different schools of thought. That said, my take, and have really started to think carefully about this, especially with the role that the labor movement must play in this moment around racial justice issues. Race is and has always been a tool to divide and conquer, right? The idea that and I'll get to where some of this is coming from, race being a tool to divide and conquer. Before this and leading up to this, the momentum and awareness that has come from continued tragedy of state violence and white supremacy violence in our society, the moment where we're having more critical conversations around race and recognizing that we're at a pivotal moment, that's when we start to see waves of this anti-CRT propaganda, confusion coming up and popping up in different communities, not only all over our states, but all over the country. And I started to do a little research, a little digging. And the first thing that I had to Google, I was like, ALEC and CRT. And for folks who are not familiar, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is an acronym. And this organization is an organization that is comprised of many corporate entities and corporate leaders who have a very clear conservative stance on a variety of different issues. Specifically, when it comes to unions, it's an anti-union platform. And there's a variety of ways and tactics that they use to attack unions. And it's no surprise to me that there's some connection between these anti-union forces and this anti-CRT propaganda. And I use the word propaganda intentionally because some of the tools that we're seeing shared out are these talking points, right? The infographic talking points that are being shared in different communities that if you really dig in, and Dr. Mark Lamont Hill is the person that's really taking these folks to task around this. But these tools are just mobilizing communities to use it as a weapon to attack educators who are doing the important work of making sure that their curriculum, their teaching is culturally and historically responsive, right? In New Jersey, just to give you a further example, we have legislation that was passed years ago that created this Amistad curriculum, which is really African-American history inclusion across K-12. And it's something that's required across New Jersey to infuse key elements of African-American history into our K-12 education and curriculum. We have a new LGBTQ plus curriculum inclusion legislation that's passed. We have many forces pushing back on that too, and mobilize with what seems like these weaponized talking points. You're seeing it show up in Board of Ed meetings where parents who are bullying tactics, really bullying educators, bullying board members, bullying administrators into submission around some of these things, while at the same time, to circle back to our initial point, we are not teaching CRT, which comes from a legal scholarship lens, right? But they're using that as a blunt weapon to attack folks who are doing that. And really, you know, just to name it, it's really white fragility pushing back to protect itself, right? It's not about teaching accurate history. It's not about questioning, you know, there's the way they frame it is as if we're trying to indoctrinate students and young people. But I know when I was in teaching social studies, I am presenting you with multiple perspectives and what sources are these primary sources? Are these secondary sources? Let's analyze it. Let's understand it. Don't take my word for it. Actually, we want you to develop the critical skills to unpack and analyze what I'm saying, what anyone is saying, right? So that you can dig into and make sense of the resources that you're unpacking, right? That's actually a skill that we would like people to develop. So it's interesting too that CRT implicitly has the word critical and race, right? Anything that seems race related will be under attack. Anything that's critical thinking also under attack. Problematic. And problematic for what reasons? I mean, we live in a democracy. We understand that being informed citizens and having a critical mind is essential to democratic institutions. So really, it's such a fascinating moment. Fascinating is one word I could use. There are many other words I could use that I would love to use. But I will say that, you know, if I'm giving my take on where this is all coming from, it's again another realignment of corporate ed reform, anti-union forces utilizing the moment of white fragility and white privilege, seeking to reinforce itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes to all of that. The neoliberal privatizers and everyone else trying to. I've been told by a superintendent before that I was indoctrinating students because we did a play called Speak Truth to Power, which is a great piece for young folks to get into. And it documents the stories of human rights activists and defenders around the world. And that play included Rigoberta Menchú. And in his opinion, she's a terrorist. And my response was, you mean the one with the Nobel Peace Prize? She's a terrorist? And he said something else that was wild to me, but my response was, well, I guess one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, because I mean, she got a Nobel. So like what? Like, I don't understand. But yeah, you are absolutely right. Critical thinking is what we want young folks to do. And I teach the same thing. I teach a very specific style of playwriting called verbatim, which requires students to pick a topic, place, issue in our society, and then determine who are all the stakeholders around that issue, and then go interview all of them and create pieces that honor people's humanity and narratives, no matter if you agree or disagree with them. And students have written some pretty powerful things, and watching them struggle with performing a monologue that they've written based on an interview with a person that they totally disagree with, it is a fascinating learning experience in not only critical thinking, but critical empathy. Learning to dialogue with a community of people on different sides of an issue and understanding that there are not two sides to a story. Sometimes there's 12, and we should understand all of those perspectives, or understand that spectrum of perspectives, and that not everything is like this or that, that to get out of that binary thought process and really think critical about all of the information coming in and going out. And so I don't understand where people get that thought from, that we are. But I mean, I do, because you said it. You nailed it. That's exactly it. So to that point, what advice might you have then for given your classroom experience and your experience as a union leader, for educators who are feeling as though they are being targeted for teaching truth and for centering their students in their curriculum?
What I've found effective, and mind you, we're real time thinking through this attack. So the defense strategy against those who are trying to bully us, right? Those who are trying to bully us, it's all contextual. So I've heard situations where educators, like you've described, are getting harassed, intimidated, bullied by people in their community, right? So community members, you're seeing it show up in certain ways with administrators who are also adhering to the pressures that they're experiencing from community members. So what I'm hoping, because I think in framing my response, it can't only be an individual response. It needs to be a collective response. And the union does need to play a critical role in making sure that we're defending our educators and protecting our educators and taking a clear stance on where we are with regards to this. But the thing that comes to mind is we're talking about critical questions, right? So I would love to engage in a conversation with those who are perhaps attacking some choices we've made with curriculum and ask, why? What is it about this particular lesson that is problematic? If the issue is that you are assuming it's related to critical race theory, then where exactly are you seeing critical race theory show up in this particular lesson or this learning objective, in this methodology that I'm choosing to? So we are the professionals, right? Own that space as the professional and ask the questions of those who are levying these attacks upon us by educating. I think about, the example you shared earlier about just being on Zoom and then having parents perhaps recording or looking for those gotcha moments where they're going to try to undermine you. I wonder if, doctors, healthcare professionals, lawyers, people who perhaps in our society, even whatever roles you associate as professionals whose opinions you respect, right? Hold ourselves to that same standard as the professionals in this space and ask the questions, in a way that's not necessarily a counterattack, but if we are staying in that place of curiosity, modeling that critical thinking and educating at the same time, I think that will help not only address the attacks that we're up against, but also invite those who are levying the attacks to consider where their thinking is coming from and challenge them to actually be more self-critical around what exactly their issue is, right? And then if that's the tactic or tactics that we model and master, then A, we're still staying in that space of critical thinking. B, we're owning our role as the professionals in education. We had to go through a variety of different coursework and spend, years mastering our craft and, diving in. We talk about how complex and nuanced and challenging and incredibly rich this profession is, this craft that we endeavor in as educators. And, invite people to think about that, through conversation and dialogue. Now, mind you, I'm thinking of a Jay-Z quote: "A wise man told me don't argue with fools because people from a distance can't tell who is who." That also resonates. So understanding where you're engaging folks in this dialogue and how you are engaging folks in this dialogue, when it's grandstanding at a school board meeting, when really, I'm talking about a New Jersey circumstance, you may be seeing parents lobbying the school board, when if the curriculum mandates are coming to the state, my civics educator mind is thinking, appreciate you showing up to the board, school board, local school board, asking questions. And here's the civics education moment. If it's a state mandate to teach African-American studies, LGBTQ plus inclusion curriculum, and you should be attending the state school board of ed meetings to lobby there and actually trying to overturn the legislation. And that's not me being facetious. That's actually a process. If you want to be successful, I'm going to help, teach you the tools and the navigational capital that you might need if that's what you want to do in our democratic system. But I think asking those questions, grounding ourselves in our professionalism and, staying true to our principles is what I think we should be doing.
I agree. I mean, that question and strategy is literally what we do with students, right? And you said it earlier, like, I encourage kids to disagree with me all the time. Do not take my word for it. I don't know nothing. I know what I know, but I don't know what I don't know. Same goes for you. Now, challenge me, ask me, say something. You know what I mean? When I was teaching literature, I always told students that there was no right or wrong answer if your response is supported by the text. If your mind made a connection where I didn't see one, guess what? You got an A. Like, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong or tell you your art is bad. Like, I'm here to make you think and analyze, synthesize, and draw your own conclusions, and then fully communicate that conclusion to me. Like, that's the skill that I'm teaching. Whether it was right or wrong, I don't know, like, that's up for debate. But it also makes me think about, you quoted Jay-Z, the song that's in my head is Questions. I'm pretty sure it's on like Water for Chocolate, Common, and Mos Def. And it's a song that just talks about the absurdity of just stuff that don't make sense. Like, how I'm feeling about this school year. I keep saying to myself, can somebody make it make sense? I need for somebody to make it make sense. And the part from the verse that was playing in my head is, why do I need ID to get ID? If I had ID, I wouldn't need ID. How you got high expectations but got no patience, right? And the course just goes on. It's the questions. But like, just the absurdity of some stuff that we are put through. I'm baffled. Like, I'm like, what the heck? Like, how is this even the thing? Why is CRT a debate? Why are we opening schools all across the country as if it is normal when there is a Delta variant raging? Like, the numbers are up to where they were when we thought it was a good idea to shut the schools down in the first place. So opening schools now? What? Like, elementary school where none of the kids can get vaccinated yet? Like, the questions, like, I don't understand it, fam. And the second song that came to my mind is Words I Never Said by Lupe Fiasco. And this is one of my all-time favorite songs. And I think because it reminds me of one of my all-time favorite poems, which is Litany for Survival from Audre Lorde. And every time I listen to this song, I imagine Lupe having a conversation with Audre if she was still alive. But there's a part in the song where he says, Your child's future was the first to go with budget cuts. If you think that hurts, then wait, here comes the uppercut. The school was garbage in the first place. That's on the up and up. Keep you at the bottom, but tease you with the upper crust. You get it, then they move it so you never keeping up enough. And then in the chorus, he says, it's so loud inside my head with words that I should have said. As I drown in my regrets, I can't take back the words I never said. And the song wraps up with, now we can say it ain't our fault if we never heard it, but if we know better, then we probably deserve it. I think that all the silence is worse than all the violence. Fear is such a weak emotion, that's why I despise it. We're scared of almost everything, afraid to even tell the truth. So scared of what you think of me, I'm scared of even telling you. Sometimes I'm like the only person I feel safe to tell it to. I'm locked inside a cell in me. I know that there's a gel in you. Consider this your belling out, so take a breath, inhale a few. My screams are finally getting free. My thoughts are finally yelling through. And this song, these two songs have just been on repeat in between my panic attacks about going back to school as if everything is normal. Just thinking like, as we are making headway, I think we are making headway in this fight for a racially and socially just public education system for every single student, no matter who they are, where they come from, what's their citizenship status or the language they speak or how they identify. We about to force everybody back into the classroom and to hell or damn with any of the trauma that causes for educators or students. We just gonna do it. And that saying, like, if we know better, we do better. And so I'm saying, like, don't we know better? How many mofos across our industry, in the union, in the classroom, in administration, at the state level, have multiple degrees? You know better. We're forever looking at data and analyzing data like we know better. And yet we cannot figure out how to do better. And honestly, it's because I don't think any of us were in charge in the first place. Classroom teachers, admin at the school, it's not in our hands. It's other folks outside of our profession, outside of our training, that are constantly telling us what to do. And yeah, I'm waiting on somebody to make it make sense for me.
You and me both, sister. I'm just trying to think, like, part of it when I think about the decision makers, I'm like, okay, are you prioritizing public health in your decision-making thought process? If the answer is yes, then there's a lot more questions that come up in my mind, right? If the answer is no, then the follow-up question on my mind is, what is superseding public health? Is it an economics rationale? Is it a political pressure rationale? Like, what is driving your decision-making? Because it does not seem or appear from afar to be, folks, public health. And so that's definitely a question. And I love the songs that you chose. The line that's resonating with me from what you shared on Lupe's song, I think that all the silence is worse than all the violence. There's something about that that's resonating with me right now, because as we were talking about the CRT, as we're talking about the issues of reopening, it's almost like, where are the folks that are feeling ready to push back on those who are trying to bully and move and power play and do all the things that are leading to the circumstances that we're facing? So I think that all the silence is worse than all the violence. I think that all the silence is worse than all the violence, and especially when it comes to this racial justice work, we definitely need folks to break out of their silence. All the folks that were on the verge, and, no shade to people who are performing, their alignment with racial justice, performative kind of allyship type of ways. But we need folks to really step up and break that silence. And it can't always just be the educators of color. We need, our aspiring anti-racist white educators, our aspiring anti-racist white organizers, parents, and other folks, administrators, to also break that silence and, challenge some of these things so that the labor doesn't always disproportionately fall on those who are being harmed by the system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned it earlier, but I just want to circle back to it. Critical race theory is not explicitly taught in K-12 classrooms. And I think folks need to understand that we use pedagogies and frameworks like culturally responsive teaching and ethnic studies and other, some folks might use Afrocentric teaching in their spaces, but it is not the same thing as anti-racist teaching or trauma-informed practices either. And folks are taking all of these concepts, terms, ideas, things that we went to school for quite some time to learn and study and mushing them all together as this indoctrination thing. Now, CRT does play a role in what we should be doing to help students think critically about systems and structures that ultimately will affect them in their future. But also it's a part of that hidden curriculum. And educators of color take this on in addition to all of the other things that we have to do on a day-to-day basis. There's this another layer to our role in students' lives where we have to sort of coach them on how to navigate the systems and structures, which I hate that that's like a thing, but I have to. When Black girls come to me at lunch to talk to me about going to college and need to know honestly what that experience is like, or Pacific Islander students need to come to me and talk about how do we break away from our family traditions or the expectations so that we can follow our dreams. Or when other immigrant students come talk to me like, Miss, I want to major in theater, but this is not something my Indian family will let me do. Like, these are conversations we have to have often with students who look like us and are probably going through a lot of the things we grew up going through. And so it plays a role, but we're not explicitly teaching it because these aren't graduate level law courses that we're teaching. We are in K through 12 settings. So I don't understand where folks are getting that from, but I will shout out two scholars that you should definitely go listen to, pick up their work and read. Kimberly Crenshaw, who gives us intersectionality and digs deep into CRT. And also, I believe her first name's Deborah King. She gives us an article on the multiple jeopardy of that intersectionality and how each of those intersections play out in your daily life. But I got one more question before we wrap up this episode. I am sure many folks listening, and I know you too, we have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it is a seminal piece of work for anybody in any sector of education. And he says in that book that transformation boils down to a cycle of reflection and action. And that is like quintessentially what we do as educators, right? We implement, we assess, we reflect, we make changes. We implement, we reflect, we assess, we make changes. So how do we create that transformation to this system, to education as a whole that we know we need when we don't have reflective leaders who are capable of not only working in community or even, I believe, even understanding what transformation is?
That's a major question. But I just circle back to the fact that we need to model what it is that we are hoping and aspiring for our students to one day model and elevate in terms of critical thinking, in terms of critical questions, critical empathy. And you brought up the point earlier about, CRT, if there are students who are going to one day be in law school and you have a program in your school, for the record, if you have a program in your school that's preparing them for law school, teach CRT. there's actually nothing wrong with that. That's actually helpful, right? You want them to have as much access and as much insight and as many perspectives and as many theories and frameworks as they can to be prepared for further learning and further professional roles. But I digress. I want to say that, I think it's really important for us to continue to model and stay grounded in what we're doing. I do believe that the tactics that are being used right now are a sign that there's an attempt to distract us from the purpose that we're aiming to do. And it's not at all to indoctrinate students. It's to invite students to become their best future selves. And if that includes students with a global mindset, a global citizen mindset, a mindset that actually asks questions that are centered around making humanity better, making civilization greater, making the arts, sciences, history, making all of the, beautiful things that we know that our next generation behind us are capable of, that we perhaps didn't achieve, then let's invest in those students to become their best future selves and continue to stay focused on that and model what we want our students to, the skills that we want our students to hone. So yeah, don't be distracted, y'all. Let's just stay the course and do what we do best.
Absolutely. One of my greatest wishes is that every kid who comes through my classroom leaves being their own best advocate. Like that's the goal, right? Like you need to know how to take care of yourself and others ultimately, right? Like content be damned. Like no matter what class or school you go through, like you should leave a better person. We are going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you for joining us for episode 3 in season 2, a genuine message to educators this school year. We are expendable, clearly. I think I mentioned it on another episode, but it's still stuck in my head. We don't have a teacher shortage per se. We have a people shortage at the moment. We have just, for those of us who are lucky enough to still be alive, we have survived an international pandemic. And your health, your safety has to be your priority. Someone said it to me last week. If you got sick right now with this variant, they would very quickly make sure that there was a replacement in your classroom and wouldn't think twice about it. Let's not go back to any of the dark places we might have been over this past year. Let's do our best to push our districts and elected officials to do better, but also be ready to let the fight go when our bodies are asking us to rest, because we cannot do it all the time for everybody. Sometimes we just have to do for ourselves. And honestly, your kiddos will understand. When I am having a down day and my kids know it. I mean, I'm sure you've had those experiences. You had really bad days, something went wrong, you're in the classroom, kids see it on your face, and there's that one kid that's like, hey, y'all, we got to be extra quiet today. She got a headache. Like, she don't feel good. Be good. You know what I mean? Like, your kids always have your back. So just hang on to that. Focus as we enter classrooms, focus on you, focus on them, focus on relationships and conversations, and just loving on yourself and your students in a way that you are all able to center your humanity for one another. Fa'afatai Talalava, thank you for listening.
Salamat, thank you for listening.
We want to thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your love and support.
Continental Shifts podcast can be found on Podbean, Apple, Spotify, Google, and Stitcher.
Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube for archived footage and grab some merch on our site.
And join our mailing list for updates at consciouspodcast.com. That's CONSHIFTS podcast.com. And follow us at con_shifts on all social media platforms.
Dope educators wayfinding the past, present, and future.
Keep rocking with us, fam. We're going to make continental shifts through dialogue with love all together.
Fa Fatai, thanks again. Tofa, deuces.
Much love. Peace.